Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode that I've called Boeing 747, the plane that shrank the world. And let me start off with a quote from 2023. This is at a ceremony to commemorate the retirement of the jumbo jet, the 747. So here's the quote. "It is the most well thought out and safest aircraft ever built. Even when you understand the science behind flight, there's nothing like seeing a 747 take flight to remind you that there's also magic here." And of course, it takes someone from Hollywood to bring in the whole magic world and get all those connotations of what it is like to fly and to take off on a 747. So the guy who spoke those words was John Travolta, the actor. And anybody who knows anything about John Travolta will know that he is an absolute plane nut. He's a licensed 747 pilot, and he's a huge fan of the plane. And actually, if you Google his house, and I recommend you do, he has planes, even a 707 jet, parked outside his house. He's runways outside his house. As I said, Google John Travolta's house. It's pretty amazing. But what I find even more interesting than the magic of the 747 as it takes flight, more interesting about it being the safest aircraft ever built, is the story behind the 747. Like, the agreement to build it was sealed with just a handshake on John Wayne's yacht. And as we shall find out, John Wayne's yacht isn't your normal kind of yacht. There's also the story of how Boeing overcame massive obstacles to build the biggest plane in the world up to that point in just 3 years. That was 30% faster than any other plane was built up to that stage. And to do that, of course, they had to build the biggest factory in the world. And this remains the biggest factory in the world. And its construction, it almost brought down Boeing. It almost brought down Pan Am, who was Boeing's partner in the initial development of the 747. And as you'd expect also, there are big personalities in the story. It is fantastic. Enjoy. So for a bit of context, we're talking about the 1960s. And at this stage, air travel was really starting to take off. Forgive the pun, because you'd the jet age, you'd aircraft like the Boeing 707, they'd really slashed journey time, so costs were falling, and for the first time, millions and millions of people could actually afford to travel by air. Now, the prices were still pretty steep. Like a flight from New York to London was $450 back then. That's the equivalent of $5,200 today. So it was still a luxury of sorts, but the price was coming down. And the most influential and powerful figure in the whole aviation business at this time, and who had been the most powerful for the last 30, 40 years, was a guy called Juan Trippe. He was Pan Am's founder. So he's a very interesting character. Born in 1899 to a wealthy New York family. He was Yale educated. He went to fly as a fighter pilot in World War I, but the war ended just before he got to the front lines. In 1927, he founded Pan Am Airways with just a single mail route between Florida and Cuba, because back in the 1920s, the money in aviation wasn't in passengers. Initially, it was airmail. And so Trippe was able to use money then from his very exclusive elite Ivy League friends and fellow pilots to buy up small airline holdings, all these other mail routes. And because this money came from these rich families, he wasn't under real pressure for fast returns. So he had time to build his business. Now, he also had time to spend in Washington, because Trippe was a very smart and good lobbyist. He knew how to play the political game. So he went to Washington and he argued that competition, I love this, competition would weaken the American image abroad. And he essentially said, I'll act as America's arm abroad. I'll build the airfields, I'll build the radio towers, the routes, and in return, I want exclusivity, in effect, a monopoly. And he got it. So Pan Am became the unofficial flag carrier of the United States, and they had exclusive rights for international routes. So by the late 1930s, it was the largest transport aviation company in the world. And as air travel opened up to passengers, it was Trippe who understood that for air travel to have a future, it needed to become cheaper. It needed to become more affordable to the everyman on the street. And this is a quote from him. He said, Pan Am had a choice, a very clear choice, of becoming a luxury service to carry the well-to-do at high prices, or to carry the average man at what he can afford to pay. Pan American has chosen the latter course. And Tripp, he really was a big disruptor in the business. He was the first to bring in what was called tourist class fares from New York to London. So this cut the round trip fare by more than half, and it caused such consternation between the airports and the airlines, who more or less had a cartel where they fixed prices. And of course, this led to Tripp falling out with other airlines and airports. And actually, Pan Am was barred from flying into Britain for a while. And Tripp himself, he wasn't the kind of guy I'd say I'd get on with. Here's a quote from Time magazine. One, Tripp was not a model chief executive. He didn't delegate well. He made big deals without telling his top managers. He almost single-handedly built a world airline, Pan America, but often acted as if he owned the world. So very arrogant, very self-assured, but he wasn't charismatic. He was described as being quiet, often mumbling, very socially awkward, but also Machiavellian. And he had zero loyalty to anyone. He would fire managers in an instant if he thought they weren't doing what he wanted them to do. And despite being married with 4 kids, he was married really to Pan Am. He was a workaholic. Now, he was also very good, as well as the lobbying and as well as building Pan Am into the biggest airline in the world. He was very good at playing manufacturers off each other. It kind of reminds me of Michael O'Leary of Ryanair, the way he manages to play the manufacturers off each other to get the best price. Well, Tripp was very good at that. And he would also push manufacturers like Boeing and Douglas to build aircraft that didn't even exist yet. He wanted larger, faster, more ambitious aircraft. And he then would back it up with huge orders. And the way he worked was that once they decided on a new aircraft, he would then put in an order so big that it would tie up that factory for up to 3 years, so none of his competitors could then buy those modern planes for like 3-4 years. So that again gave him a huge competitive advantage. But by 1965, Tripp had been in charge for 4 decades, and his monopoly was starting to fray at the edges because the government was opening up international flights to other airlines like TWA. So he needed something new. He needed something bigger. And this brings us to the summer of 1965, and we're on John Wayne's yacht, the Wild Goose. And as I said earlier, it's not really a yacht. This is a 136-foot converted World War II minesweeper. And at its centre was this huge saloon with a big U-shaped velvet sofa, a large fireplace, mahogany wood, cigar smoke, bourbon. You know, it was designed for, I suppose, long nights of conversation where America's most powerful gathered, because Wayne hated the Hollywood scene. That wasn't his scene at all. This was more his scene. He preferred hosting these get-togethers with the most powerful people in business and in politics. And that summer, 1965, the man that Tripp wanted to talk to on John Wayne's yacht, stroke, minesweeper, was Bill Allen, Boeing's president. And Allen, he's another very interesting character. He wasn't a pilot, he wasn't an engineer, he was this lawyer who'd spent 20 years as Boeing's legal counsel. But how he got to be their CEO was that after World War II, 1945, the military orders from the government to Boeing, they just collapsed. And Boeing literally went from 160,000 employees to 30,000 almost overnight. And they were bleeding cash. And then Boeing's president died suddenly, and the board turned to Allen. And he reportedly told them, I'm not qualified. You know, he didn't think he was suited to the job, but they obviously knew him better than he did. And they pressed him to take the job. He did, and they were proven right. Allen is this tall, lean guy. He has a slightly weathered, scholarly face. He was a man, I suppose, of very high ethics, very honest, no ego at all. And he was famous for saying to the engineers, I don't understand that. Explain it to me like I'm a lawyer. So in other words, strip away all your technical jargon and just tell me what it is exactly you're doing. And Allen is credited with establishing a culture at Boeing that lasted for decades, and it centered on the idea that the quality of engineering was central to everything. So build the best aircraft and the profits, they'll follow. And despite, you might think, okay, well, he's this lawyer, he's obviously very meticulous, he's obviously very cautious. He was in some ways, but he also took huge risks. If he thought they were worth taking, he took them. And the first big risk he took was in 1952, when he bet 16 million, all of Boeing's profits, to build the prototype for what would become the Boeing 707. And this was without any single order from any airline. He just went ahead and built the 707. And this was a big gamble at the time, because back then the airline industry still relied on and still trusted propeller planes. Now, a British aviation company called de Havilland, they had built the first passenger jet in 1952, but it was a disaster. In 1954, 2 of those jets crashed and everybody on board was killed. So airline CEOs like Wantrip, they were terrified of jets, not just because of the danger that the de Havilland jets showed, but also they were loud, they were heavy on fuel, they required longer runways than most cities had at the time. But Alan and Boeing, with its emphasis on engineering excellence, they got it right with the 707. It launched in 1957, and pretty quickly, Wantrip, he could see the potential. Because up to this point, the propeller planes, they could carry 60 to 90 people, and a flight from London to New York took 12 to 14 hours. Compare this with the 707, it could carry 180 people at twice the speed. So New York to London, you're talking 6 to 7 hours. So Tripp, then, he placed a massive order, and within a few years, the 707 had the majority of the world's long-haul market, and Boeing was the king of commercial aviation. So when we get to that meeting, going back to John Wayne's yacht, or Minesweeper, 1965, Alan and Tripp, they know each other very well, obviously, by now. But Alan isn't, too enamored with Tripp. He finds Tripp infuriating. He finds him too pushy. He finds him even underhanded. But he also knows that when Tripp backs a project, he bets big and he's willing to back it with a lot of money. So the actual pitch from Tripp to Alan was that he said, I want you to build a jet that can take 400 to 500 passengers. And the actual conversation was, Tripp said, if you'll build this, I'll buy it. Alan replied, if you buy it, I'll build it. And that was it. They shook hands on it. No formal contract. That came a few months later in April 1966, when Pan Am placed an order for 25 Boeing 747s, an option for 10 more, so roughly 20 million per aircraft, total order between 525 and 550 million, about 5 billion in today's money. It was the largest single commercial aircraft order in the history up to that stage. And the delivery deadline was the end of 1969. That was 30% faster than any airliner development up to that stage. So it was a huge gamble for Tripp, yes, but for Boeing, it was a massive, massive gamble, because the development budget, you're talking about 700 million, about 7 billion adjusted for inflation in today's money. A huge, huge gamble, far above any other commercial jet project. And to fund it, Boeing had to take on the largest debt in its history. And under the model that existed then, and I presume up to now, that airlines will pay most of it on delivery. So Boeing had to float the development costs for years. And any delays, any problems that they ran into, it could sink the company. Now, once they agreed on they're going to build this, Tripp then, he was very hands-on. He had some design requirements. He demanded, first of all, that the nose of the plane could hinge open for cargo loading. And the reason for this is really, really interesting, because everyone in the aviation business back then, they believed that supersonic airlines were the future. Remember, this was the 1960s. NASA was putting men into orbit. The British and French had started work on the Concorde in 1962. The Russians had started their own supersonic plane as well. And Boeing itself was working with the US government on a supersonic project called the Boeing 2707, which would have been faster than the Concorde and bigger, carrying up to 300 passengers as against Concorde's 100 passengers. So, back then, the 747 and jet engines were seen as a stopgap, because once supersonic took over then, they wanted to be able to convert their 747s into cargo planes, hence the nose that could hinge open. So it gave the 747 its iconic bulge. Tripp also insisted on a double deck, but Boeing pushed back. The guy who led the engineering for the Boeing 747 was a guy called Joe Sutter. He is a legend in Boeing's history, and he led a team of engineers that were called the Incredibles. So they're a very tight and loyal group. And Sutter was one of the few people who could and would stand up to Tripp and challenge him. And he pushed back and said there was no way that they'd be able to evacuate everybody within 90 seconds, which is the time frame that you need to evacuate a plane. So he eventually convinced Tripp that they would just have a wide single deck, and Tripp eventually relented. But then Tripp insisted that he wanted to use the unused space in the hump of the 747 to become this swanky upper deck lounge for premium passengers. Sutter hated the idea, but he gave in on that. So a bit of give and take on both sides. And now, of course, Boeing had to deliver. And the first obstacle they had was that they didn't have a factory big enough to build a 747. So not only did they have to build a brand new, unheard of plane, 30% faster than ever before, they also had to build a whole new factory, what would become the biggest factory and the biggest building in the world ever. And they chose this sprawling 780-acre site at Everett, Washington, about 25 miles north of Seattle. And they aimed to have the factory done in just a few months. And there were huge challenges. Like the nearest rail line was 5 miles away, and it was far, far below the site. So to get all of the huge parts, not just for the building, but also for the plane and everything, they had to build one of the steepest railway lines in the US. Local homeowners had to be bought up. One of them held out until he got about 10 times the price of his house to sell up. And then there was the weather. As soon as construction started, they had 67 straight days of rain, so it turned the whole site into this huge mud pit. Snowstorms followed that winter. And when the facility was completed, it was, and I said it still is, the largest single building in the world in terms of volume. Now, I'm saying volume. Its footprint is 4.3 million square feet, which isn't the biggest. But the overall volume, because of the size of this huge building, is 472 million cubic feet. And I love this fact. The building, it was so big in those early days, and before the ventilation was properly figured out, the condensation would build up near the ceiling and then literally fall back down. So you had light rain inside the factory. And I mean, just getting that factory built in a matter of months, like, it makes you wonder and admire the private sector. Like, can you imagine if government projects were approached with the same level of focus and intensity? That in itself was such a fantastic feat. Now, the pressure on Boeing must have been huge. We mentioned the scheduling pressure. I mentioned the financial pressure. But they were also stretched really, really thin because they were also working at the same time on the 737 jet. This was designed for shorter city-to-city flights. They were also working, I mentioned, on the government-funded supersonic prototype. And on top of all this, there was all the technical and engineering risk because nothing of this size and scope had ever been tried before, or the complexity. Like, this was all new technology. Every major component of the jet had to be built from scratch. Like, you have an unprecedented wingspan. You had landing gear that needed to support over 700,000 pounds, roughly double anything else out there. You had electrical and hydraulic systems that needed far more power than ever before. And even the simulators that the pilots needed to practice on, they had to be invented from scratch. And of course, as you'd imagine, the company was obsessed about safety because they all knew that a 747 crash would be the most catastrophic airline crash ever. So, as a result, Boeing adopted this unprecedented fail-safe design. So no single failure could doom the aircraft. That was the thing. So they built in backups for every critical system. So each ready to take over if the main one failed. Now, central as well to the whole 747 design were its engines, which hadn't even existed up until this stage as well. And they had to be developed from scratch from a company called Pratt & Whitney. Now, this is something I didn't know. For some reason, I always thought Boeing made their own engines, but of course they don't. They've always relied on companies like General Electric, Rolls-Royce, and this company, Pratt& Whitney, to develop their engines. So this new engine had to be designed in parallel with Boeing designing the airframe. Now, as we move into 1968, the Everett factory, it's humming away with activity. Over 50,000 people would eventually work on the project. That year, Bill Allen retired. He stayed on as chairman, but the leadership went to T.A. Wilson. He was also a Boeing lifer. He was gruff. He was famous for chewing on an unlit cigar. And while he didn't have Bill Allen's, I suppose you'd call, diplomacy, he did have the engineering expertise, and he was a very, very tough pragmatist. Another very, very good CEO. And this is one thing that strikes me about Boeing back then. And I suppose you could compare it to Boeing over the last few years. They had fantastic CEOs back then. Now, on September 30th, 1968, the first completed 747 was rolled out of Everett. Now, I say rolled out because, of course, the engines weren't ready yet. There were 26 flight attendants there at this ceremony because each attendant represented one of the 26 airlines that had put in an order for the 747, and in total they had 150 orders. Then, 5 months later, February 9th, 1969, the first 747 took off. On the first test flight, the pilot was Jack Waddell, and the maiden flight lasted about an hour and a half, and Waddell said afterwards, "It handled magnificently. It's a pilot's dream." But as the tests were continuing throughout the year, there was one big problem. The Pratt & Whitney engines. They were powerful, but they were unpredictable, and sometimes they surged, sometimes they actually stalled. Now, Pratt & Whitney, they kept on insisting that the problems were minor, so Jack Waddell, he decided to show the Pratt & Whitney executives exactly what was going on, and he took the top executives from the engine manufacturer on a test flight, and he pushed the jet to the absolute edge, and one of the 4 engines surged. There was this huge bang. It was, they said, like a cannon going off in the cabin, and the entire aircraft shuddered, and then a long sheet of flame blasted out of the engine that had surged. And in the back, these Pratt & Whitney executives who, only earlier had been saying this is a minor problem, they went white as a sheet. And Waddell, completely calm, turned back to them and said, "Is that minor enough for you?" Now, the plane had 4 engines, so they were able to land, but that ended the debate. The Pratt & Whitney engineers, they committed to a full fix, which did resolve the worst problems, but it cost them time, and this was costing Boeing big time. Like, the project by this stage now, it was burning through $5 million a day. Their funds were nearly all gone. And the initial deliveries, which were planned for late 1969, had to be pushed into the new year due to the engine issues. And also, they were waiting to get the certification from the FAA. That was the linchpin. And then, in the final weeks, just before they were meant to get certification, disaster struck when a test aircraft came in too low. On approach, it hit the ground short of the runway, and the impact, it tore off part of the landing gear, damaged 2 engines. It scraped along the runway before stopping, but there was no fire, no one was injured. Investigators ruled that it was pilot error, and crucially, the incident, it kind of highlighted how strong the 747 structure was. So finally, April 30th, 1969, the FAA granted the 747 its airworthiness certificate, and Pan Am took delivery of the first 747 in January 1970, and it was christened the Queen of the Skies. Then in the early hours of January 22nd, 1970, the first 747 commercial passenger flight, it took off from New York, carrying 335 passengers and 20 crew, and it landed in London to great fanfare. Now, when I saw that figure, 335, I was like, wait a second, wasn't the 747 meant to carry 500? Doesn't it carry 500? It does, but these first models, they were built for luxury. There was a lot more legroom. There was a VIP lounge in the upper deck, the one that Tripp had insisted on. And then an awful lot of the airlines got their 747s customised. For example, American Airlines, they had a piano bar in economy class. Can you imagine that? The Continental 747s had lounges with sofas. So early 1970 saw a lot of big 747 launches with some of the biggest airlines in the world, and Boeing delivered 92 jumbo jets in 1970. But the timing of the 747, it couldn't have been worse, because by the end of 1970, as a result of, you have the Vietnam War, in America you've billions being spent on huge social programs, you've the high interest rates, the economy plunged into a recession, and business travel, luxury holidaying, you know, that plummeted, and Boeing's sales pipeline dried up completely. In 1971, Boeing got only 7 new orders. By this stage, you're talking about development costs of over $1 billion. Boeing's debt was at $2 billion. It was on the very edge of insolvency. And then came another blow. As a result of the recession, the government-funded supersonic project, it was completely cancelled. And this got me thinking, whatever happened to all those supersonic projects? I mean, you have the Concorde, which was around for a while, but now that's gone. Well, the reason why supersonic never really took off, and again, excuse the pun, is because the economics and the physics. Because sonic booms, that big sound it makes, meant that planes could only fly fast over oceans. And the fuel costs were huge. And also the likes of the Concorde, it was only carrying 100 passengers. So the tickets were massively expensive. So it was never a good model for mass travel. Now, apparently, with new technology and easing of regulations, supersonic flight might finally be making a comeback. Anyway, getting back to Boeing's woes. So they're teetering on the brink of collapse now, and Wilson has to go to New York and negotiate with 20 banks. He does a good job. He famously told them that if they didn't keep lending Boeing money, they would own a giant factory with a bunch of planes that they wouldn't know how to sell. So essentially, by this stage, he was saying to the banks, look, you're as much a prisoner as the 747 as we are. So the banks really had to just keep giving him money. But Wilson also, he restructured big time. Wages were cut by 25%. Tens of thousands of employees were laid off in 1970 alone, which had a huge negative impact on the Seattle region. Now, Boeing avoided outright bankruptcy because they diversified into military, space contracts. They also focused on their short-haul jet sales. And it wasn't just Boeing, like the whole aviation industry by this stage was in a deep, deep crisis. Like Lockheed had to get 250 million government loan to keep going. But by the start of 1972, there were glimmers that Boeing had stabilised. But then, 1973, a big crisis again. You have the Yom Kippur War, sparked a geopolitical crisis. Oil prices quadrupled within months. And of course, demand for air travel just plummeted, especially the long-haul international routes that the 747 was built for. Yet, despite all of this, and you've got to give Wilson a huge amount of credit here, like while 1973 and 74 were challenging, they weren't catastrophic because it remained profitable marginally thanks to the belt tightening and the diversification with defence space contracts. They were accounting for nearly half of Boeing's business. And then in 1975, global economy was stabilising, air travel demand began to gradually pick up. New 747 orders, they started trickling in, and as we move into the 80s, Boeing dominated long-haul markets and revenue started climbing into the multi-billion-dollar range. So its debt was reduced and refinanced, and they had very little, if no competition really, because the Airbus didn't build a plane big enough to challenge the 747 until the 90s. And so what about One Trip and Pan Am, Boeing's main partners throughout all of this? They didn't fare so well. So Tripp himself, he stepped down in 1968. That was just a year into the whole 747 project after nearly 40 years of absolute control. And because of his power and control over the company, there wasn't any real successor. There was no second in command who had ever truly been trusted or tested. So what he left behind was a company loaded with debt from the 747. And then there was the recession, followed by the oil crisis and demand collapsing. And unlike other major airlines, Pan Am had a fatal weakness because it didn't fly domestically. All its flights were international. So it was completely exposed. And by 1974, the situation, it was so bad that Pan Am went to the US government for a bailout and they were refused. They only survived because they got a massive loan backed by the Shah of Iran, reportedly worth hundreds of millions, and that kept the airline afloat. My God, how times have changed when you have the Shah of Iran and Iran supporting an American company for survival. Anyway, it survived, and like Boeing, as we get into 1975 and the remainder of the decade, travel starts to pick up again. But Pan Am, it never regained its position as the titan of the aviation business, because deregulation in 1978, it opened up the floodgates to competition. Pan Am never really recovered. In 2023, as I mentioned at the start of the show, Boeing stopped production of the 747, and the reason was price, because new engines, they become so powerful and reliable that twin engine planes like the Boeing 777 and the 787, they can now fly across the ocean a lot more cheaply than the four engine 747. And so that was the end of the 747. And when we look at technology that changed the world, and we think of the steam engine, the telephone, the personal computer, the iPhone, well, the 747 is right up there. It democratized long distance travel. By the 1980s, the average transatlantic fare in real terms had fallen by more than 40% compared to the late 60s. So it enabled mass tourism on a scale that didn't exist before, and that's why it was called the plane that shrank the world. And over 5 decades of its existence, it carried 5.6 billion passengers. And what I love, though, is the story behind how it was built. The blood, the sweat, the tears, the extraordinary effort, the ingenuity, pushing boundaries, achieving what was once thought impossible, and the characters behind it. That's what makes the story of the 747 such a good one. And that brings us to our listeners' emails, and this one comes from Mike, who would love to hear the story of Kim.com. Remember him? He owned Mega Upload, and he was arrested in New Zealand way back in 2012. I remember the day when he was arrested. It was huge news. Tens of millions of dollars were seized and frozen. He was supposed to be extradited to the US, but he's still living in New Zealand, still fighting extradition, and his story is an incredible one. So thanks so much for the suggestion, Mike, and for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.